Tonight, we are not here to chase sleep, but to understand what prevents true rest. We will not discuss what you know, but rather how that knowledge shapes the invisible chains you might not realize you're wearing. This is an invitation to let the body relax, softening into the mattress while allowing the mind to remain profoundly alert, just long enough to perceive the hidden architecture of the world you inhabit before the final descent into unconsciousness dissolves it. We are searching for the power concealed beneath the mundane surface of modern life, the quiet mechanisms that compel us to act against our own deepest freedom. If every assumption of personal liberty is simply an efficient mechanism of control internalized, the question becomes inescapable. Are you truly the sovereign of your own conscience, or merely the most effective jailer you've ever had? The concept that unlocks this uncomfortable truth is the Panopticon. It is not just an old blueprint for a prison. It is the operating system for modern compliance, the blueprint for the self-governed society. Take a deep, settling breath. You are, for this moment, safe in the confines of your room. But the walls of this safety are perhaps more translucent than you think. What if the fundamental feeling of being watched, of being obligated to conform, never required an actual watcher to be present? Michel Foucault focused his gaze on the 18th century design dreamed up by philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Visualize it clearly: a massive ring building surrounding a central observation tower. In the cells of the ring, light pours in from the outside, making the inhabitants perfectly visible. The central tower, however, is fitted with shutters and blinds, casting those within it into darkness. The key to the Panopticon is not force, but visibility for the observer, and unverifiability for the observed. The person in the peripheral cell never knows if the guard is currently looking out of the tower window. They only know that the guard could be present. Imagine yourself placed in one of those peripheral cells. You cannot see the center. You cannot verify if the gaze is upon you. Immediately, your actions change. The spontaneity of behavior dissolves. Why? Because the potential for observation becomes psychologically indistinguishable from the act of observation. This is not mere supervision. It is the radical induction of self-supervision. You become the active, continuous enforcer of conformity upon your own body and mind, solely out of fear that the gaze might, at this exact moment, be directed your way. The profound genius of the Panopticon, Foucault argues, is that it works most efficiently when the central tower is empty. The guard can be removed, the apparatus mothballed, yet the system of control sustains itself perfectly. Power detaches from the individual wielding it. It becomes automated, disembodied, anonymous. It forces the subject to police their own behavior, not out of love for the law, but out of rational fear of the immediate consequence of being caught deviating. The Panopticon thus teaches the individual to render themselves passive, predictable, and compliant, making them the indispensable agent of the very power structure that limits their freedom. Where is this transparent prison today? It has abandoned brick and mortar. It lives in the algorithms that constantly track and assess your behavior online, in the social metrics that quantify your worthiness, in the ubiquitous cameras and sensors that record your movements, and in the performance reviews and data profiles that dictate your professional future. We are enveloped by invisible, calculating evaluators. We perform our lives for the anticipated gaze of systems, whether they be the credit score calculation, the social media feed, or the corporate HR file. We edit our opinions and shape our behavior preemptively because we exist in a state of continuous, recorded visibility. The psychological impact of this continuous visibility is profound. It fosters docility and the erasure of genuine moral choice in favor of compliance. We sacrifice spontaneity and inner resistance for the sake of public predictability. The most insidious element is that we begin to justify, even embrace, this constrained existence. We label our self-censorship as responsibility, our conformity as professionalism, and our lack of radical thought as maturity, forgetting that the initial impulse was simply the quiet fear of judgment emanating from the darkened central tower. The prison is perfected not when the individual is physically contained, but when they stop rattling the bars and instead busy themselves ensuring the bars are clean and polished for the benefit of the guard who may or may not be looking. The Panopticon is simply the external threat successfully translated into the architecture of the self. As you lie here, relaxing your muscles and slowing your heart, ask yourself, who are you performing for, right now, in the silence of the dark? Knowledge power. Deconstructing truth as a tool of control. This is where Foucault sharpens the knife. This is the moment we stop looking at knowledge as a sacred map to reality and start seeing it as a blueprint for the prison you live in. We call this framework, terrifyingly, the regime of truth. You spend your life searching for truth, the truth about yourself, the truth about the world. But why is it that every time you feel you found a definitive answer, it doesn't bring liberation? It brings a new set of rules? That creeping sense of restriction you feel? The anxiety that comes with self-diagnosis? Or the pressure to perform wellness? That is the silent hum of the power-knowledge nexus at work. For Foucault, knowledge is not something discovered floating innocently outside of human affairs. It is produced inside institutions of power, the clinic, the courtroom, the university, the psychiatric ward. These institutions authorize certain statements as true, and by doing so, immediately gain the authority to discipline and manage those who do not conform to that truth. This concept, pouvoir, savoir, power, knowledge, is inseparable. The moment you name a deviation, you establish the corrective power required to fix it. The truth in this sense is simply the most powerful fiction available for ordering society. To illustrate this, consider the examination, not the test you took in school, but the clinical or psychological examination. When you sit before a doctor, a therapist, or a hiring manager, they are armed with categories, DSM manuals, performance metrics, behavioral profiles. When they apply these categories to you, they are not passively revealing your internal nature. They are actively turning you into a subject that can be managed. If the 19th century doctor needed to create the category of hysteria or sexual pervert, it wasn't because these categories suddenly appeared in nature. It was because the social and moral order of that time required new ways to contain behaviors that threatened it. The truth of the diagnosis justified the confinement, the treatment, the power imbalance. Here is the bitter irony. We embrace knowledge precisely because we believe it offers escape, yet the knowledge we create is often the highest quality tool for our own normalization. Foucault asks us to consider how we internalize the structures meant to examine us. The external gaze of the institution doesn't just watch, it teaches us how to watch ourselves. You become the most efficient warden of your own prison. You police your thoughts, evaluate your productivity scores, scrutinize your mental health against accepted parameters of normalcy, and push yourself toward an ideal of the subject who is well. an ideal constructed by the very forces that profit from measuring and correcting you. The pursuit of authenticity becomes simply the optimization of the self according to prevailing standards of acceptability. Look at how this manifests today. We quantify everything: sleep, steps, mood, focus, worth. Algorithms define your truth, what you want, what you believe, what you need to buy, making you perfectly legible and therefore perfectly governable. The truth about you, generated by data points and diagnostic language, is not owned by you. It is a resource owned and used by systems to maintain order and extract compliance. When you spend 3 hours obsessing over why you lack motivation, you are engaging in the self-disciplinary practice demanded by the regime of productivity. You are using the tools of knowledge, psychology, self-help, behavioral science, to fix the deficiency those tools first defined as existing within you. The profound psychological shift happens when you realize that your deepest insecurities often stem not from personal failure, but from failing to adhere to a statistically constructed, historically contingent definition of normal. This truth is a kind of freedom, but it is a destabilizing one. It means the work is never about finding the single, objective truth. It's about recognizing the power dynamic inherent in every claim of knowledge. It forces you to ask, who benefits from me believing this about myself? Who authorized this specific definition of success, happiness, or sanity? Sleep on that tension tonight. The knowledge that promises to free you may, in fact, be the softest leash you have ever worn. To be truly free, perhaps, is not to find the truth, but to refuse the definitions others have prepared for you. We are all products of a truth we did not choose, but we are also the only ones capable of turning the mirror back on the makers of that truth. Never mistake the clarity of a diagnosis for the inevitability of its consequences.
The docile body, the silent discipline, sculpting our behavior. The docile body, how we are trained to love the leash. Have you ever wondered why you feel anxious if you are 5 minutes late? Why you instinctively apologize for taking up physical space or for speaking without being called upon? You might believe this is just courtesy, simple politeness, or perhaps maturity. But what if it's evidence of a deeper, more pervasive training? What if the structure you live within, the school, the office, the hospital, was designed not just to educate or heal, but to fundamentally remodel your very physical presence? Foucault called the result of this careful sculpting the docile body. It is not simply the absence of rebellion, it is a body that has been carefully manufactured to be both useful and manageable. It must be economically viable, capable of highly specified tasks, and politically obedient, accepting hierarchy and standardization as natural law. This transformation happens not through overt repression or dramatic violence, but through thousands of small, granular techniques that operate on time, space, and movement. The scheduling of breaks, the precise geometry of seating, the constant pressure of the examination, and the requirement for continuous visibility. Imagine the spatial and temporal divisions imposed upon you since childhood, the specific hour for awakening, the designated 10-minute bathroom break, the mandatory alignment of desks, the demand that you sit facing forward in neat rows. This organization was not purely about transmitting information. It was about learning how to be a regulated subject. The discipline breaks down the messy, organic mass of human potential into predictable, individually supervised units. We accept this order because it promises efficiency and productivity, but the real product being manufactured is us, standardized, interchangeable, and self-correcting. The paradox of the docile body is profound. The moment you internalize the discipline, the need for external surveillance becomes largely obsolete. You no longer need the guard tower. You have become your own meticulous guard. This is the crucial distinction between slavery and docility. A slave is forced. The docile body performs its own submission because it has learned to equate external order with internal sanity and competency. We meticulously police our own posture, our productivity metrics, and our emotional responses, always measuring ourselves against an invisible standard of normalcy that the system established long before we were born. You discipline yourself long before the actual authority figure even notices your lapse. That persistent, nagging whisper telling you to check email just one more time, to work through lunch, to keep your anxiety silent, that is the internalized gaze of power. Look at the contemporary rise of productivity apps, the quantified self-movement, or the obsession with tracking steps and optimizing sleep scores. We do not protest being tracked. We actively seek out new technologies to measure and refine our compliance. We tell ourselves we are pursuing wellness or peak performance, but what we are often doing is subjecting ourselves to ever finer levels of self-regulation. Our bodies become machines constantly audited by ourselves, judged strictly on metrics of output and efficiency, effectively molding us into better, quieter economic components. This relentless self-monitoring creates a deep psychological tension. We begin to lose connection with spontaneous, uncalculated action. Every movement, every gesture, becomes a potential performance reviewed by an internal critic molded by external standards. We become obsessed with avoiding the mark of abnormality, of being lazy, distracted, or unmotivated. If your carefully constructed routine fails, if your productivity drops, or if you dare to just be without an immediate justification or utility, a low-grade shame immediately kicks in. This shame is the feeling of having failed the discipline, the feeling of being momentarily useless. The most effective chains are rarely made of iron. They are woven from routine, convenience, and the quiet, almost affectionate expectation of obedience. They are the softest restrictions, worn so long that we forget we are wearing them at all, habitually mistaking the warm comfort of the well-organized cage for the true freedom of the wilderness. Few arrive here awake. Leave your mark with a like. It helps this reflection reach others who seek truth before sleep. Biopower, the state as manager of life itself. The calculation of life, when your existence becomes a state resource. You often feel watched, scrutinized for what you might do wrong, but have you considered a more unsettling form of supervision? A power interested not in your capacity for disobedience, but in your capacity for sustained life, productivity, and predictability. The pressure you feel to maintain your health, manage your stress, or even maximize your longevity. This is often not merely personal virtue, but an administrative demand wearing the mask of well-being. This is where we step into Foucault's concept of biopower. Historically, the power of the sovereign was the power to take life, the right to kill or let live. It was brutal, centralized, and visible. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, power began to shift. It became too inefficient to simply execute or exile people. Populations were becoming resources. The modern state needed living, working, producing bodies. Biopower is the force that shifts the primary objective of power from taking life to fostering life, not for humanitarian reasons, but for systemic utility. It operates on two axes simultaneously: the disciplined individual body, through schools, hospitals, prisons, and the regulated population, through statistics, epidemiology, and public policy. Imagine the state as an immense, cold-hearted life insurance company. They are not concerned with your soul, they are concerned with your viability as a contributor. They don't want you to die too soon, because that is a lost tax revenue and a wasted investment in your education. They don't want you to be sick too often, because that drains public resources and lowers overall productivity statistics. Your illness is not just a personal tragedy, it is a deductible loss on the national ledger. The crucial mechanism here is that biopower rarely feels oppressive. It feels like management, care, and necessity. The state no longer controls you by threatening death, but by mandating health. It doesn't prohibit certain behaviors outright. It statistically discourages them by linking them to higher costs, social shame, and reduced opportunities. Think of public health campaigns promoting preventative care, compulsory standardized education, the invention of mandatory retirement ages, and the vast systems dedicated to calculating birth rates and controlling epidemics. These systems manage the species body, the population, as an organic, statistical whole that must be optimized. The paradox is profound. Freedom and well-being are made into mechanisms of control. When you enthusiastically choose to exercise, eat the perfect diet, track your sleep, and engage in continuous learning, you believe you are achieving peak self-actualization. Yet, at the very same moment, you are rigorously maximizing your utility for the governing system. You are self-policing your compliance with the administrative demand to be a robust, long-term economic unit. You don't need a warden to ensure your fitness. The wellness app, the corporate HR policy, and the societal pressure to avoid being a burden on the healthcare system do the work for them. We are simultaneously the beneficiaries and the statistical fodder of this power. Look at the modern obsession with quantified self and data harvesting. Every fitness tracker, every mental health mandate in the workplace, every genetic predisposition analysis, they all feed the system. If your data shows low productivity or high stress, it is not simply an internal struggle. It is a risk factor to be mitigated, an inefficiency to be corrected by the system. Biopower is why your struggle with depression is reframed as a brain chemistry deficit requiring standardized pharmaceutical intervention, ensuring your quick return to functional output rather than a social crisis demanding radical change. The psychological impact of recognizing biopower is the deep, chilling realization that your fundamental biological existence, your fertility, your lifespan, your capacity for happiness, is not an inherently sacred attribute, but the raw, calculable material for political administration. You are a data point in a national risk assessment. Once you see yourself quantified, the line between living an authentic life and merely serving as a highly optimized resource for the state becomes painfully thin. When life itself becomes the object of power, existence is reduced to a statistic, and freedom is merely the efficient choice of predetermined utility. The most sophisticated form of control is not preventing you from dying, but demanding that you live well, efficiently, and for the benefit of the calculation. The invention of madness, when reason creates its own exiles, the great exclusion, how reason requires its opposite. Think about the moment you were told what was normal, what was appropriate, or what was sane. Who drew that definitive hard line, and what did they fear was left permanently excluded on the other side? We all carry a secret, persistent anxiety, the fear of being deemed too much, or perhaps, in our quietest moments, too little. This fear is not accidental. It is a legacy of an enormous, deliberate choice made centuries ago. For millennia, the strange, the erratic, the melancholic, and the manic were integrated, albeit sometimes fearfully, into the human landscape. They were figures of satire, prophetic visions, or tragic chaos, a dark, necessary reflection of the sprawling human condition. But around the midpoint of the 17th century, something fundamental and terrifying shifted. Reason, in its fervent Enlightenment ascent towards scientific certainty and systematic order, began to clean house. Foucault chronicles this moment as the Great Confinement. Madness, he shows us, was not suddenly discovered. It was systematically, surgically invented as a specialized problem. It was taken from the streets, removed from its poetic or symbolic context, and placed definitively within hospitals, poorhouses, and eventually the asylums, the houses of confinement. This moment was when burgeoning scientific reason declared its independence, defining itself primarily by what it forcefully rejected and isolated. Imagine a vast, empty, marble library designed to hold all the world's legitimate knowledge. To define what goes on the shelves, you must first build a stark, high-walled annex outside the main structure, a dedicated space for what is explicitly not knowledge, the babble, the uncertified dreams, the irrational whispers, the economic deviance. The architecture of the asylum, the fence around the institution, the locking of the cells, these were not merely safety measures. They were a physical diagram demonstrating where the authority of truth and order ended. The imposed silence inside those walls became the required, stabilizing proof for the sound, rational discussion happening outside. The paradox inherent in this mechanism is brutal. Reason cannot stand alone. To solidify its identity, it requires an external, visible, negative space to cast its light upon. It demands an other, the modern physician, the psychiatrist, the legal guardian. They became the gatekeepers of sanity, wielding clinical knowledge not just as treatment, but as a weapon of classification. Diagnosis in this light is merely the formalized scientific terminology for exclusion. When you classify someone as mad, you don't just describe their state. You systematically revoke their right to legitimate discourse. Their unreason is rendered mute, unable to challenge the foundational premises of the rational world that imprisoned them. This mechanism ensures that any critique originating from the margins can be immediately dismissed as the symptom of a broken mind, not a valid philosophical or moral objection. The very comfort you feel in believing you are sane is structurally dependent on the enduring historical institutionalization of those who are deemed otherwise. Look at the boundaries we draw today. We rarely use the blunt word madness, but we employ toxic, unhinged, dangerous, misinformed, or extreme. Social spaces, both digital and physical, are constantly defining and policing new forms of deviance, political, behavioral, or emotional. If you dissent too loudly, if your emotional vocabulary challenges the prescribed narrative of positivity and productivity, or if your beliefs fall outside the recognized and accepted spectrum, the underlying machinery of exclusion is primed. We diagnose the bad citizen today with the same structural fervor that the 17th century diagnosed the lunatic, by ensuring their position is one of inherent error and failure, not legitimate difference. This enduring history of confinement breeds an insidious form of self-censorship. You quickly learn that you don't need a physical straitjacket if you effectively internalize the asylum walls. You become your own meticulous guard, checking your thoughts, emotions, and expressions against the accepted standard of sanity, productivity, and normalcy. The profound psychological impact is the unrelenting pressure to conform, not just externally, but in the deepest, most chaotic and creative regions of your internal life. We become perpetually engaged in performing our own sanity for an audience of invisible institutional censors. The greatest danger Foucault exposed is not that we fear madness, but that in our relentless historical pursuit of immaculate, stable reason, we have exiled the very necessary wilderness and unreason that is vital for genuine introspection, self-critique, and moral revolution. We built sanity on a foundation of enforced silence, and that silence always whispers back. Repressive hypothesis is talking about sex liberation or increased control. The repressive hypothesis. It is the story you were told about yourself, the beautiful mythology of modern freedom. You believe that for centuries, morality silenced the conversation about sex, forcing it into the dark corners of the bedroom and the church confessional. You believe that your generation, by finally speaking openly, by celebrating visibility, has shattered those ancient shackles. You see yourself as the torchbearer of liberation, the one who finally spoke the name of the unspeakable. But take a slow breath. This comforting narrative, Foucault suggests, is perhaps the most powerful act of historical misdirection in the Western world. What if the silence you fought was never truly silent? What if the supposed repression was actually a calculated, deafening roar disguised as quietude? This is the repressive hypothesis, the belief in the great Victorian no, and Foucault's response is to dismiss it entirely, not as a misunderstanding, but as the foundational myth of modern control. Think back to the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. We assume a great repression took hold, a vast silence surrounding all matters of the flesh. But look closer. Did sex simply disappear? No. It migrated. It proliferated, becoming the subject of obsessive, detailed, and bureaucratic conversations. The priest was joined by the doctor, the psychiatrist, the sociologist, the administrator, and the public hygienist. Instead of a single blunt prohibition, we saw 1,000 specific technical instructions. The language wasn't silenced, it was intensified, refined, categorized, and pathologized. This wasn't a silence, it was a discursive explosion. Sex was no longer about sin or reproduction, it became about the deep, secret truth of your identity. It demanded to be mapped. We created the nervous woman, the frigid wife, the masturbating child, the perverse homosexual, categories that were not suppressed but meticulously detailed in medical textbooks and case studies, transforming the simple act of desire into a complex web of identities that could be studied, judged, and managed. The central mechanism here is the shift from power that forbids to power that incites. If power truly wanted silence, it would have achieved it. Instead, power demands confession. It asks you to name your urges, to classify your desires, to speak your truth, believing that in speaking, you achieve autonomy. But when you confess, you are not simply expressing yourself. You are subjecting your internal landscape to an external grid of intelligibility. You are giving the system the data points necessary to understand, measure, and crucially, optimize your existence. The moment you defined your sexuality, you provided the necessary knowledge for others to govern it. The freedom to speak became an obligation to disclose. You see this mechanism perfectly realized today. We live under the mandate of mandatory visibility. The system doesn't want you hidden. It needs you to articulate your identity, your trauma, your preferences, and your kinks, and broadcast them onto the public sphere. Is this liberation, or is it a far more sophisticated form of social surveillance? You are encouraged to embrace your difference, but only so that your difference can be sorted, placed into a consumer demographic, and monitored for statistical deviance. The psychological impact of realizing the repressive hypothesis is false is profound, shattering the comfortable illusion that emancipation lies simply in volume. The darkest insight is that perhaps the modern project of sexual liberation, the relentless therapeutic pursuit of self-knowledge and self-disclosure, is not freedom from power, but power's most successful strategy. It turns your deepest, most intimate urges into resources for institutional control. When you finally speak, you are not tearing down the prison walls. You are merely helping the architects map the interior rooms more precisely. The constant compulsory talk about sex, identity, and desire does not make us free. It renders us utterly, brilliantly legible. If you want to find the true counterpower, perhaps it lies not in the constant noisy confession, but in the dangerous potential of true intentional silence. Because sometimes when the truth of the body is spoken, the body itself vanishes into the categories of the language. The microphysics of power, identifying daily strategies of domination. The microphysics of power, seeing the capillaries of control. You spend so much time searching for the visible chains, the big, obvious mechanisms of oppression, the tyrant, the unjust law, the heavy hand of the state. But what if the true locus of control is woven far more finely, deeply embedded in the thread count of your daily routine? What if the mechanisms of domination are microscopic, silent, and entirely accepted, perhaps even desired? This is where Foucault takes us, deep into the uncomfortable truth of the microphysics of power. Power, in this view, is not a possession. It is not something the king holds. It is a relationship. It is an intricate web of infinite tiny techniques and arrangements that circulate throughout the social body, shaping behaviors, defining norms, and manufacturing the very idea of what is considered normal. We are talking about the subtle tyranny of the standardized form, the mandatory meeting time, the architecture of the office, the design of the classroom. These arrangements operate not through blunt violence, but through the highly rationalized ordering of space, time, and human bodies. They are designed to make you predictable, visible, and, above all, productive. Consider the efficiency expert who designs your workflow. They are not trying to oppress you, they are trying to optimize you. They track your login times, measure your output metrics, and restructure your schedule to eliminate dead time. Each adjustment, seemingly small, is a deployment of power designed to subject you to a greater system of measurable compliance. The power dynamic isn't the boss yelling at you, it's the constant internalized obligation to meet the metric, even when no one is watching. The moment you accept that metric as a necessary part of your identity, you have internalized the power relationship. You become the guard and the prisoner simultaneously, patrolling your own performance. The great paradox of the microphysics of power is that these strategies are often successfully marketed to us as liberation or self-improvement. Think of your consumer technology. Your fitness tracker diligently records your sleep quality, your steps, and your calorie count. It gives you data, allowing you to take control of your health. But what it truly does is subject your biological reality to a universal standard enforced by an algorithm. Your physical existence is turned into measurable docile data, governed by statistical norms. If you fail to meet the required 6 hours of restful sleep, the device prompts you to correct yourself. The technology doesn't just monitor deviation, it manufactures the definition of deviation itself. This creates a state of perpetual, hyper-rationalized self-discipline. The slightest deviation from the prescribed norm, the missed workout, the unread email, the 5 minutes wasted scrolling, is not just a minor slip. It registers as a moral and systemic failure. You are living your life under the watchful, indifferent eye of efficiency. Look closer at social media. It is the ultimate laboratory for microphysical power. Every algorithm that curates your feed, every standardized reaction button, every trend that dictates the acceptable aesthetic of your existence is a subtle deployment of power. It guides what you consume, how you react, and what kind of public self is deemed valuable. We willingly enter this system, performing our lives not for authentic emotional connection, but for visibility and approval, subjecting our intimate histories to the constant, anonymous gaze of the network. This manufactured visibility is what grants or denies us social worth. The profound philosophical impact of recognizing this system is that it makes the quest for freedom infinitely harder and infinitely more intimate. You realize you are not merely subjected to power, but that you are the active site through which power flows and is regenerated. True liberation is not about rising up against a visible regime. It is about untangling yourself from the internalized structures that dictate how to organize your morning, how to measure your success, and even how to understand your emotional needs. It forces you to question the very logic of your efficiency. Stop looking for the heavy chains and the monolithic structures. Start looking for the invisible threads that tie your self-worth to the smooth, unwavering rhythm of the machine. The tyranny is not in the decree. The tyranny is in the internalized expectation. The cage is not built outside of you. It is constructed minute by minute, deep within the logic you use to organize your own day. Governmentality, the art of guiding conduct. This is the subtle, almost undetectable shift in the architecture of control, the concept Foucault named governmentality, the gentle cage. You believe, deeply, that you are the sovereign ruler of your own life. You are making rational choices about your diet, your career, your retirement savings, and your mental health regimen. You're tracking your sleep, optimizing your routines, maximizing your efficiency. But stop for a moment, let the weight of the blanket settle, and ask yourself this uncomfortable question. Who taught you how to be rational? Governmentality is not simply the act of the state ruling its subjects. It is the comprehensive, calculated art of governing. It's the strategic network that connects political power with forms of knowledge, statistics, demography, epidemiology, psychology, and management theory. It is the rationale deployed to manage populations, resources, territories, and, crucially, individuals, not through brute force or explicit prohibition, but through the gentle guidance of conduct. It operates in the space where the politician meets the professor, where the law meets the algorithm. It is the silent imperative that you must manage your own life efficiently. Imagine the shift from the medieval system to the modern one. In the age of the king, power was visible and centralized. The threat of the scaffold, the explicit law. If you broke the rule, you were punished. But in the age of governmentality, the power is distributed and internalized. Consider the modern corporate wellness program. It is presented as a gift, a free gym membership, a tracking app, a seminar on stress management. The explicit purpose is your well-being. The underlying invisible purpose is the management of productivity, the reduction of healthcare costs, and the elimination of risk associated with an inefficient employee. You are not forced to participate, yet you are gently nudged, incentivized, and ultimately normalized into participation, because participation is now defined as the benchmark of responsibility. Here is the essential paradox of the gentle cage. Authority no longer commands you. Authority provides you with the freedom to govern yourself, provided you govern yourself according to the parameters of optimal efficiency and health established by external experts. The old power demanded obedience. The new power demands your freedom be expressed through conformity to the norm. The mechanism is insidious because it makes you your own supervisor. The disciplinary gaze of the Panopticon has been digitized and miniaturized, placed right in your pocket. You track your steps, your heart rate, your caloric intake. When you miss your goals, it is not the state that criticizes you. It is your own dashboard, your own sense of personal failure. This is the ultimate victory of governmentality, turning the subject into the manager of their own subjection. Political control is outsourced to personal responsibility. Look at the pervasive nature of social media, the curated feed, the algorithmic nudges. These systems aren't built on rigid laws. They are built on continuous assessment of conduct, guiding us towards specific purchasing habits, specific political opinions, and specific ways of performing wellness. The imperative to constantly optimize, hack your life, and become your best self is not a personal rebellion. It is the central mantra of governmentality, a system that ensures we spend all our energy managing ourselves rather than questioning the system that defines the standards of management. The psychological impact of this endless self-governance is chronic, low-grade inadequacy. If success is defined as perfect self-management, then failure to achieve that standard is internalized as a moral or psychological deficiency. You are not oppressed by tyrannical laws. You are simply an underperforming asset in the economy of self. It shifts your focus from external injustice to internal flaws, keeping you perpetually busy, attempting to fix yourself, rather than fixing the society that dictates the impossible standards of your optimization. Rest now, with this unsettling realization echoing softly in the silence. We have mistaken the freedom to choose our chains for actual liberation. The most effective power is not the power that forces you, but the power that teaches you how to willingly guide your own conduct, believing, right up until the point you drift into sleep, that every decision was entirely and only your own. Order of things. Deciphering the hidden structure of our thought, the episteme, the unconscious rules of historical thought. Have you ever felt like you were speaking the absolute, undeniable truth, yet the entire world was running on a fundamentally different operating system, a deep architecture of thought that renders your own logic irrelevant? Tonight, we're not just looking at the surface of power, but at the geological strata beneath it, the silent historical structure that determines what counts as truth, what counts as science, and what simply cannot be spoken aloud. Tonight, let's look at the software we can't uninstall. This is the episteme, Foucault's most profound and perhaps most destabilizing concept introduced in the order of things. It is not merely a worldview, a paradigm, or an ideology. Those are surface phenomena. The episteme is the total set of relations that unite the scattered elements of knowledge in a specific era. It is the unspoken, unconscious, historical a priori, the necessary preconditions for thought itself. It is the invisible archive that dictates how reality can be organized, how things can be classified, and how language can give those classifications meaning. Imagine the deep-sea diver, encased in a custom-built pressure suit. That suit determines everything: the maximum depth they can survive, the kind of light they can perceive, the limits of their motion, and even the type of communication they can utilize. The diver spends their life in the suit, so eventually they mistake the hard limits of the suit for the timeless limits of the ocean itself. They organize their world, up, down, pressure, depth, according to the physics of their enclosure. The episteme is your pressure suit, and ours. If you try to discuss wealth during the Renaissance, you are operating under a logic of resemblance and similitude. If you discuss wealth in the modern era, you are immediately forced into the logic of historical accumulation, production, and capital. The objects are similar, but the fundamental rules for making sense of them have entirely shifted. And here lies the central, disturbing paradox that Foucault forces us to confront. Our current episteme, the structure that makes you capable of understanding this sentence and categorizing your own feelings, is profoundly historical. It's an arrangement, not a destiny. We have spent the last 200 years obsessed with the figure of man, man the subject of history, man the source of truth, man the psychological entity. But Foucault suggests that man, as we currently understand the term, is a recent invention, a figure that emerged only when the classical episteme dissolved. And if man is merely a function of a temporary historical arrangement, what happens when that arrangement inevitably crumbles? This realization reveals the greatest anxiety underpinning the modern philosophical project. We are busy trying to find timeless truths about ourselves, our consciousness, our psychology, our freedom, but we are only excavating the very temporary rules that allow us to ask those questions in the first place. This is why Foucault declared the famous death of man, not as a wish, but as a historical prediction. When the structure that gave rise to the concept of the unified sovereign subject changes, the subject itself will dissipate, like a figure drawn in the sand at the tide line. Consider the present moment. We are living within the accelerating episteme of data and optimization. The unspoken rule is that all reality is measurable, quantifiable, and visible through metrics. If you argue today that a person's value resides in their internal, unquantifiable subjectivity, you are arguing against the fundamental mechanism of the system. The episteme demands transparency, efficiency, and continuous improvement, forcing us to view ourselves not as deep, complex beings, but as systems requiring constant debugging. The language of human rights, self-expression, and freedom itself is being subtly appropriated and translated into the cold mechanics of data management. The philosophical impact is immense. It pulls the rug out from under the comforting belief that we are moving toward a final, clearer understanding of human nature. Instead, we are constantly being reorganized by silent forces we cannot even name while we are inside them. This realization is profoundly destabilizing, yet also liberating. When you understand that your deepest convictions are historically contingent, you stop agonizing over the inherent truth of your era and start listening for the subtle grinding sounds beneath the pavement, the sound of the gears of history shifting. The discomfort is the sound of your pressure suit cracking. Sleep on this. What happens to your identity, your understanding of yourself, when the invisible structure that made the concept of you possible finally collapses? Listen closely. The sounds you hear tonight are not just the quiet breathing of the world, but the soft, inevitable rush of the tide coming in to erase the drawing. The Archaeology of Knowledge, excavating the foundations of our understanding. This is the silence of the earth below the foundations you stand on. Tonight, we are going deeper than history, past the specific arguments people had, into the bedrock itself. This is the Invisible Archive, Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge. We spend our lives debating what is true, what is right, what is rational. But have you ever considered the ground upon which the very search for truth must stand? What rules, unspoken and invisible, dictated what was even allowed to count as knowledge centuries ago? Let the weight of historical silence settle around you. Foucault's archaeology is not the history of ideas, it is the history of the conditions of possibility for those ideas. Think of it as intellectual geology. Instead of documenting who said what, Foucault maps the subterranean strata, the historical layers, to find the fundamental soil. The blueprint he called the episteme. The episteme is the unconscious foundational rule set, the architectural framework that governs all discourse, all science, all common sense in a given era. It is the space within which thoughts become legible, and outside of which they are simply noise, madness, or error. Imagine that you are walking through the great museum of forgotten categories. This museum holds no paintings or sculptures. Its exhibits are the discarded rules of thought. In the 17th century wing, you see the rule that classified botany by analogy and resemblance. The truth of a plant was found in its signature, its visual echo of a human organ. In the 19th century wing, that rule is replaced by the rule of classification through function and difference, the analytic table, the empirical dissection. Every age believes it has finally grasped objectivity, but Foucault shows us that objectivity is merely the current configuration of the archive. Our current rational methods are merely the rules of discourse that push the previous configuration into the basement. The central mechanism of this archaeology is silence. The episteme works by being utterly invisible to those who live within it, much like gravity is invisible to the apple falling from the tree. It is the water the fish swims in, the structure we rely upon to criticize everything but the structure itself. The tension lies here. We cannot critique the episteme using the tools that the episteme provides. To truly see the rules, you have to find the moment they shifted, the moment sanity replaced resemblance, or when the concept of the criminal soul replaced the concept of the criminal body. When you dig up the foundations, you inevitably destabilize the structure currently above ground. How does this ancient excavation apply to the present moment, right now, as you lie here contemplating the day's anxieties? Consider the concepts we accept as universal truth: economic rationality, the modern diagnostic manual of mental illness, or the absolute necessity of institutional education. We see these as objective scientific realities, but Foucault compels us to ask, what specific conditions of power, what specific configuration of governmental needs, what specific institutional demands had to be in place in the late 20th century for this exact definition of mental normalcy or economic productivity to become dominant? The moment you perceive the archaeology of knowledge, your intellectual innocence is shattered. You can no longer pretend your most profound thoughts, your insights into self, society, or justice, are simply pure, unconstrained, rational findings. They are structured findings, bounded by an unconscious architectural blueprint you did not draw. This realization breeds a profound humility and a necessary radical skepticism toward modernity's grand claims of linear progress. We realize that we are speaking a language built on historical sediment. What we call discovery is often just the rearrangement of the archive under the latest rules of power. So, let the strata of discarded certainties settle deep within your mind tonight. Listen closely to the silent architecture holding up your understanding. You are not just reading the book of knowledge, you are attempting to trace the hand that built the binding. The ground upon which you stand is built of forgotten rules, and understanding their weight is the first step toward true intellectual freedom. Sleep now and dream within the boundaries of the present age until the next shift begins. Genealogy, tracing the origin of the powers that animate us. We often seek comfort in origins, don't we? We yearn for the clean, pure starting line, the moment of noble intention, the foundational truth that justifies our current existence. We believe our deepest moral laws and social structures must have been born of reason, of justice, of some inevitable upward evolution. But what if this search for a pristine origin, this love of history with a capital H, is itself the most successful trick power has ever played? This is the core violence of genealogical tracing. The This is where Foucault steps into the quiet of the night, not to reassure you, but to dismantle the very ground you thought you were standing on. Genealogy, for Foucault, is not history. History seeks the continuity, the grand narrative, the smooth line of progress leading from darkness to light. Genealogy, however, denies the existence of any noble origin. It refuses the myth of the pure seed. Instead, it meticulously maps the battles, the accidents, the betrayals, the specific petty power struggles that produce the things we now consider eternal. It is the history of disparity, not development. It asks, where was the fight and who won? Consider the idea of the soul itself. We treat the soul as a timeless internal entity, the locus of our morality, the object we must protect and perfect. But if you follow Foucault's method back through time, especially through the penal systems and the rise of the human sciences, you find something chilling. You discover that the focus on punishing the soul rather than brutally destroying the body was not primarily a surge in human compassion. It was a technological upgrade in the administration of power. Why waste resources on spectacular public torture when you can internalize the control? When you can teach the subject to torture themselves? The concept of the soul became the precise internal mechanism through which power could be constantly exercised, efficiently and invisibly. The soul, far from being the divine origin of our humanity, is the modern prison cell we build for ourselves, policed by our own guilt and the gaze of societal norms. It is a historical tool of discipline, dressed up as metaphysics. This is the dangerous thought that genealogy forces upon you, every truth you hold dear. Every standard of normalcy, every structure you obey without question, is merely the current iteration of a forgotten power struggle. Our knowledge, our science, our psychology, our education is not a neutral tool for discovering reality. It is inextricably intertwined with the will to dominate. Knowledge is power not because it grants access to external control, but because it dictates what is possible, what is permissible, and crucially, what is sane within the human landscape. The mechanism of discomfort here is recognizing the instability of your own identity. You are defined by categories: sane, insane, moral, deviant, productive, idle. Genealogy reveals these categories were hammered into existence through specific political maneuvers and localized acts of violence, not through timeless reason. Your identity, your moral compass, the very voice of self-critique whispering in the quiet of this room, is the residue of historical forces that conquered and systematized the human mind. What changes within you when you accept this? You lose the comfort of believing in universal ethical systems, but in its place you gain the radical freedom of recognizing contingency. You realize that what has been constructed through struggle can be deconstructed through renewed critical resistance. The origin of the powers that animate us may be violent and accidental, but knowing their nature allows you to finally see the bars of the cage that are built from the inside out. You are not waiting for history to reveal your destiny. You are wading through the historical battles that made you think you had one. The past is never dead. It is not even past. It vibrates through the disciplines we accept and the knowledge we venerate, constantly defining the boundaries of what you are permitted to be. Sleep lightly now, knowing that the origins you seek are not divine, but deeply, dangerously human. They are the scars of the battles we carry in our quiet, obedient minds. The order of discourse, procedures for controlling speech. You go to sleep believing in the promise of free speech. You trust in the fundamental openness of the modern form, that every idea, however absurd, has the right to be voiced. But what if this belief is the most elaborate deception of all? What if your freedom of speech is simply the freedom to speak within a cage whose bars are invisible? This is the unsettling revelation at the core of Foucault's concept, the scarcity of speech. Who gets to define reality? Stop for a moment and listen to the world around you, not for the sounds, but for the silences. Ask yourself, when you speak, where does your voice land? Is it truly free, or is it already mapped, anticipated, and contained by a hidden system? Foucault observed that society does not simply tolerate or celebrate speech, it fears it. Speech is viewed historically as a dangerous, volatile energy that must be channeled, controlled, and made scarce. The goal is not censorship in the blunt sense, but management. We invent intricate procedures for controlling speech to neutralize the explosive power of words, setting boundaries around the sayable and the thinkable. These control mechanisms operate on two fundamental levels. First, the exterior exclusions. Who is prohibited from speaking? This includes taboos surrounding specific objects, what is dangerous to discuss, ritual restrictions, where, when, and how one must speak, and the great split between reason and madness. If your words are deemed irrational, they are not debated, they are simply dismissed and confined. But the real threat isn't the exterior censor, it's the internal constraint, the procedures you impose upon yourself. Imagine the academic conference, the high court, or the expert panel. Not everyone can step onto the podium. To be taken seriously, you must demonstrate submission to what Foucault called the discipline. You need diplomas, institutional backing, the correct vocabulary, and the implicit acknowledgement that you adhere to the established rules of evidence. The control is not a censor's red pen. It's the invisible wall of institutional approval and disciplinary adherence. If you deviate, the system doesn't silence you. It merely classifies your speech as noise, uncredentialed, undisciplined, and thus meaningless. The most powerful procedure of all is what we call the will to truth. We assume we are striving toward objective, universal truth, but Foucault reveals this will to be a historical system of selection. This system dictates who is rational enough to speak it, what methods are acceptable for finding it, and what traditions must be referenced to validate it. The will to truth is not a pursuit of freedom. It is an economic procedure for distributing authority. It ensures that only those who already possess the power, the scientific community, the established media, the institutional gatekeepers, have the authority to declare what is true and, consequently, what is worth listening to. Look at the digital world, the purported pinnacle of infinite platforms. The order of discourse persists, operating on a massive, accelerated scale. It manifests as algorithmic filtering, the enforcement of opaque community standards that silence the discordant, and the manufactured elevation of specific, vetted voices, the expert class and the approved influencer. Your freedom to speak has been replaced by the technical procedures of visibility, designed to manage the overwhelming noise and ensure that only disciplined narratives rise to the top. This insight changes how you view your own thoughts. You internalize these external procedures. You become your own most effective censor. You pre-edit your dangerous, radical, or merely original ideas before they even leave your mind. You filter your speech to fit the discipline required by your profession, your social circle, or your platform's algorithm. Because the cost of stepping outside the established discourse is the profound loneliness of total exclusion from the very conversation you wish to enter. This is not oppression by silence, but oppression by irrelevance. We fight fiercely for the right to speak, failing to realize that the real power lies not in who shouts the loudest, but in who possesses the authority to declare your words meaningful or simply noise, and who controls the procedures that define the boundaries of accepted reality. The final discomforting echo is this: you are free to speak, provided you first agree to play by rules that were never designed for you to win. Heterotopias, the other places that contest our reality. You know that heavy silence right before sleep truly takes hold. It's the silence that makes the four walls of your bedroom feel less like a sanctuary and more like a container. We spend so much of our waking energy trying to escape, trying to flee the structure of our routine, our environment, the relentless standardization of our days. We usually look to the non-existent for that release, the ideal society, the perfect life, the utopia. Tonight, let's talk about the places that are actually here, the places that actively break the rules of being. Foucault called them heterotopias, the quiet rebellion of other spaces. A heterotopia is not a fantasy, and it's not a dream. It is a real, geographical location that exists in paradoxical relation to every other space. It is a mirror and a negation simultaneously. It is the place that contains multiple incompatible realities within its single boundary, demonstrating that the normal space surrounding it is neither natural nor inevitable. This is why they are so dangerous to the established order. They introduce friction. Consider the classic illustration Foucault offered, the ship at sea. It floats, yes, but it is its own finite piece of land. It moves between ports, yet it belongs to none of them. It carries a population, the crew and passengers, who live by temporary communal laws, separated entirely from the rigid legal structures of the mainland they just left. It is a self-contained fragment of otherness, a non-place in the world. It exists to show you that the world can be organized differently, even if only for a few hundred feet of deck space. The function of the heterotopia is always critical. It forces the reality outside its walls to justify itself. Foucault identified two main organizational types. First, there are the heterotopias of crisis, spaces reserved for individuals in transit, passing through defining thresholds. Historically, these were often hidden: the sacred garden reserved for menstruating women, the traditional marriage bed, the boarding school where adolescents transition violently from childhood dependency to adult responsibility. They manage social transformation away from the public gaze. Second, and far more unsettling, are the heterotopias of deviation, places where society stuffs those whose behavior deviates from the constructed norms. The psychiatric hospitals, the prisons, the rest homes. These spaces function like giant refuse containers, making normal space seem safer, cleaner, and morally superior by contrast. They are reality's organized trash cans and simultaneously its secret laboratories for social control. Think about the modern equivalents that permeate our lives now. Consider a museum, a stack of time, where incompatible centuries and civilizations sit side by side, perfectly ordered, yet fundamentally unreal in their cohabitation. A museum is a space that allows time to accumulate, unlike ordinary space where time flows and dissolves, or perhaps the ultimate contemporary example, the screen you are staring at right now. The internet is a heterotopia par excellence. It is a non-physical space that connects all places, yet belongs to no political geography. It's where your real-world identity is suspended, fragmented, and reorganized according to a new set of digital laws. Here, you are simultaneously present in your quiet bedroom and engaged in a riot thousands of miles away. It is the perfect accumulation of disparate locations and conflicting identities, contained within a single interface. Why does recognizing this instability matter to you tonight as you drift toward sleep? Because when we acknowledge these other places, we realize that the space we call normal, your home, your commute, your office, is just another, highly successful type of heterotopia. It is simply the one whose rules won the argument. Our common reality is just the most enforced, the most invisible, the most mundane set of spatial regulations. The sheer power of this thought lies in its capacity to destabilize everything we take for granted. Recognizing the mirror or the negation makes the original suddenly unstable. It makes you feel the seams of your own enclosed life, the arbitrary nature of the fence you live behind. The inherent discomfort of the heterotopia is the freedom it offers, the knowledge that your present reality is neither universal nor inevitable. Sleep now, but know that the world outside your door is riddled with these cracks, these quiet, powerful places where reality takes a breath and becomes something else entirely. Look for the ships, even if they are just floating memories. The death of man, the end of an idea, the birth of a liberty. This is the final, most unsettling conclusion Foucault offers you tonight: the death of man. You hear that phrase, and your immediate, defensive reaction is one of dread. It sounds apocalyptic, nihilistic, or perhaps like a warning about ecological collapse. But we are not talking about the end of human beings. We are discussing the end of an idea. The death of man is the long-awaited funeral for the philosophical subject that has dominated Western thought for the last 2 centuries. The autonomous, rational, sovereign being who simultaneously sits at the center of the universe as the knower and provides the only true object worth knowing. This humanist man, the capital M subject, is not eternal. He is an invention, a recent one. He appeared around the turn of the 18th century, conjured by the specific alignment of knowledge systems we call the human sciences: psychology, sociology, political economy. Before that historical moment, man, as a comprehensive universal category, did not exist in the same way. Instead, there were subjects defined by their function within a divine order, an economic role, or a linguistic classification. When the idea of man emerged, he became the ground zero for all knowledge, the very foundation we built our world upon. But Foucault suggests that anything that has a historical beginning must also have a historical end. Imagine you are walking along a vast, shifting coastline at the very edge of an encroaching tide. You stop and carefully, meticulously, draw a detailed, beautiful face in the damp sand. You step back and admire it. You declare that face, this arrangement of sand, to be the central truth of the beach, the pinnacle of its structure. You spend centuries trying to define the exact slope of the nose, the curve of the chin, and the precise moment of its creation. You build entire sciences devoted to the preservation and perfection of this sandy visage. But the face is simply a momentary impression, a configuration made possible by the current state of the elements. The rising tide, Foucault warns, is not chaos, but a historical shift, a new episteme, a different way of organizing reality. And when that tide comes in, the face of man will be erased, like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. This metaphor reveals the central paradox that ultimately sentences the idea of man to death. The sovereign subject attempts to define himself by using the very language, structures, and systems, the prison, the clinic, the school, that created him. He is trapped in a closed loop. He studies himself as an object, yet he is the tool doing the studying. He constantly seeks to define his own freedom and essence, only to construct more confining templates and categories under the guise of enlightenment. When you try desperately to find your authentic self, what you are often doing is trying to conform to the historical template of the sovereign, self-knowing subject. You are trying to be the face in the sand, even as the waves crash closer. The psychological release in this concept is profound. If the universal template of man is finally dissolved, if the category of the absolute, knowable individual vanishes, then the ceaseless pressure to conform to a universal, ideal standard also disappears. The liberty Foucault hints at is the freedom that comes from recognizing that you are not a fixed essence, but a site of intersection, a temporary formation of history, language, power, and biology. Your agency is not found in dictating your essence, but in understanding the specific contingent forces that shaped your present form. You are relieved of the burden of being the center of everything. You no longer have to solve the universe just by looking inward. The death of man means the birth of a space, a radical opening, where difference, discontinuity, and fluidity are celebrated, precisely because there is no longer a single standard benchmark against which all lives must be measured and ultimately judged. So let the idea of man finally die tonight. Let that confining historical fiction fade away. The space it leaves behind is not a void to be feared, but the quiet, liberating realization that your identity is not a monument built to last forever, but an open text, ready for the next configuration. Sleep now, under the weightlessness of a forgotten category. You are still here, but the idea that constrained you is finally dissolving into the deep, dark water. We're halfway through this journey. Maybe you've closed your eyes, but your mind is still learning. Subscribe now and stay with us for what's coming next. Technologies of the Self, the art of sculpting an ethic. The deepest control isn't exercised by the camera outside, but by the relentless sculptor within. You are constantly applying force to yourself, attempting to cohere into a structure you deem worthy. This is the essence of Foucault's late masterpiece, The Technologies of the Self. This idea shifts the entire focus of power. We move away from prisons and insane asylums, the grand external mechanisms of control, and look into the daily quiet efforts you make to manage your own soul. The technologies of the self are the practices, the rational and calculated regimens that people use to define, observe, and transform themselves. This concept is rooted in the ancient Greek idea of epimeleia hautu, the care of the self, which was not merely self-indulgence, but a profound ethical and political imperative. It includes journaling, confession, rigorous diet, meditation, physical exercise, and the cultivation of specific internal attitudes. These aren't tools for finding some hidden, authentic self. They are tools for actively producing a self, shaping your raw existence into a deliberate work of art. Imagine you are not a vessel to be filled, but a block of marble. Your life is the ongoing process of chipping away everything that is merely incidental, reactive, or externally imposed, leaving behind only the form of conduct that you have determined is beautiful and ethical. When you choose to deny an immediate impulse, when you consciously modulate your anger or refuse the comfort of distraction, you are deploying a technology of the self. You are sculpting an ethic out of sheer, difficult will. The finished product is not a static piece of knowledge, but the continuous aesthetic quality of your daily conduct. Here lies the profound, uncomfortable paradox. These technologies often mirror the very mechanisms of power Foucault spent his life exposing. We gain freedom through self-constraint. We achieve autonomy by choosing the chains that give us leverage. You submit yourself to a regime, an internal discipline, because you believe the resulting structure will be more robust, more noble than the self left to chance. The tension is palpable. How do you differentiate between the self-monitoring that leads to ethical mastery and the self-surveillance that merely internalizes external societal pressure? The line between ascetic virtue and neurotic obsession is thin, and it is a line you draw yourself, daily. In the modern world, the technologies of the self have been wildly commercialized and digitized. Look at the explosion of life hacking, the quantified self-movement, the relentless optimization of productivity, the extreme diets, the morning routines championed by every successful CEO. We have turned self-care into a competition for efficiency. We mistake maximizing output for cultivating virtue. We now use technology to track, analyze, and confess our failures to ourselves and to the marketplace, often under the guise of authenticity. Are you truly seeking an ethical life, or are you just optimizing a brand? Are you sculpting marble or just polishing the veneer? This realization fundamentally shifts your relationship with morality. When morality ceases to be a list of universal prohibitions, a static system of thou shalt not, and transforms into an aesthetic project, how shall I live beautifully? If your life is an artwork, then the failures are not just sins, they are flaws in execution. This introduces a terrifying, radical responsibility. If your self is manufactured through deliberate effort, you are entirely accountable for its integrity and its lack thereof. You cannot blame nature or fate or even society entirely. You must look at the choices you made with your chisel. The self is not a discovery waiting to be unearthed, but a continuously maintained practice. The work is never finished. Your final freedom is the knowledge that you are the author of your own constraints, and the only true masterwork is the shape of your resistance. Games of truth. Understanding truth as a strategy of power. The games of truth. When telling the truth is exercising power. Think now about the last time you felt compelled to speak something deeply authentic, something difficult or vulnerable. Was the experience truly liberating, or did you feel perhaps a subtle strategic leverage gained over the listener or the situation? Tonight, let us stop chasing the shimmering absolute called the truth and instead examine its tactical deployment, its function as a tool, a powerful invisible weapon used in the endless quiet conflicts of human organization. This is what Foucault called the games of truth, jeux de vérité. It is not the search for objective reality. It is the study of the rules, the procedures, and the rituals by which certain statements achieve the authoritative status of truth within a specific historical moment, within a specific institution. Truth is not something found, it is something played. The game defines the field of play, be it a courtroom, a laboratory, a church, or a political debate, and it legitimizes the moves that can be made. The true power lies not in the content of the statement, but in the authority granted to the system that pronounces judgment on its validity. Consider the ritual of the confession, perhaps the oldest and most pervasive game of truth in the West. Whether you are kneeling in a booth or reclining on a therapist's couch, the game requires you, the subject, to perform an act of self-exposure. You must reveal your flaws, your secrets, your deepest contradictions. This seems like an act of profound freedom, a cleansing of the soul, but the framework is entirely hierarchical. You are commanded to speak your hidden truth, and in doing so, you submit yourself to the definitions, the morality, and the corrective power of the listener's knowledge. Your painful truth becomes the required payment for redemption, normalization, or acceptance. The moment you express the truth about yourself, you simultaneously provide the system with the precise data needed to better govern, categorize, and control you. Here is the central paradox. The moment a culture fixes a statement as the truth, be it a scientific consensus, a religious dogma, or a psychological diagnosis, it gains the power to simultaneously define its opposite, the lie, and, most importantly, it establishes the mechanism for punishing or neutralizing those who speak outside the boundary. The game is never neutral. It is fundamentally a strategy of exclusion and validation. If the only way to be recognized as sane, credible, or ethical is to participate in the authorized game of truth, then the act of speaking truth is inherently an exercise of power against yourself and against those who refuse to join the discourse. How does this manifest in our modern, sleep-deprived world? Our current games of truth are played through data and digital visibility. We are constantly confessing, not to a priest, but to the algorithm. Every click, every search, every purchase is an entry in your digital confession ledger. The resultant profile, the truth of who you are, is instantly weaponized. This algorithmic truth dictates what you see, who you connect with, and even how you feel. We confuse this technologically constructed representation of ourselves with genuine authenticity, allowing the system to govern our behavior by merely holding the mirror of our own data up to us. The profound psychological impact of understanding the games of truth is that the focus shifts entirely. You are no longer desperately seeking an authentic inner self to reveal. You begin observing the rules of the discourse that demand that self be revealed. Liberation is found not in speaking the whole uncomfortable truth, but in recognizing that the truth you are asked to speak is merely a mandated position within a strategic conflict. The goal is to move from being a pawn, providing data, to becoming an observer of the architecture of the game itself. The greatest danger is believing that truth is purely an ideal. The deepest insight is understanding that every claim of truth is, first and foremost, a claim to authority. Sleep now, but let this thought linger. When you wake, look closely at who benefits when a particular statement is decreed undeniable. The power of truth is never found in its purity. It is found in the hands that hold the key to the game. The identity trap is defining yourself, liberation, or a new prison. You spend your entire life trying to define who you are. You chase clarity, coherence, and certainty. But take a quiet moment and ask, when you finally chisel that perfect statue of the self, who holds the hammer, and what are you really burying under the rubble? This is the identity trap, the precision of the self. We have been relentlessly taught that self-definition is the ultimate form of agency, from psychological profiling to career aptitude tests. The modern directive is know thyself, but with a demanding caveat: know thyself and then remain consistently and productively that self. This relentless urge for specificity, this demand to label ourselves as an introvert, a maximalist, an Enneagram type, a certain political orientation, is presented as liberation. It is sold to you as the key to finding your niche and your community. Instead, Foucault suggests it often serves as a highly efficient tool for institutional and self-imposed control. Why? Because a precisely labeled subject is a manageable subject. If you can define yourself perfectly, you have successfully narrowed the perimeter of your own potential. Imagine you are an architect designing a magnificent structure, but before you lay the first stone, you insist on drawing the blueprint in absolute microscopic detail. Every beam, every fixture, every piece of insulation is plotted out. The plan is flawless. The only problem is that the moment the world shifts, the technology evolves, the humidity changes, a new desire enters your heart, that flawless blueprint becomes a straitjacket. You cannot build the structure you need. You can only build the structure you meticulously documented years ago. The identity you define is not a flexible foundation. It is a commitment to a historical, often simplified version of yourself. The trap is deceptively simple. We use definitions to fend off anxiety. We crave the relief of saying, I am this, because it spares us the terrifying burden of saying, I could be anything. The undefined self is boundless, and boundlessness is exhausting. When you proclaim, I am a logical person, you successfully block the messy, irrational emotional data that might complicate your worldview. When you commit to a single career identity, you rationalize the abandonment of every other possible life path. Defining the self is often an act of preemptive self-censorship. You become the warden of your own category. Every time a new thought or desire surfaces that contradicts your carefully curated narrative, you don't explore it. You judge it and suppress it, using the very definition of who you are as the official execution order. You learn to police your own interior life, ensuring that your behavior remains consistent with the dossier you created. The liberation promised by the self-help movement, be authentic, often translates into an obligation to perform the definition you already bought into. Look at the modern digital square. Identity is currency. We trade in definitions, bios, hashtags, curated feeds. You must establish your brand. This isn't just marketing yourself, it's internalizing the market logic of continuous, predictable output. If you are inconsistent, you lose followers, you lose conceptual value, you lose the narrative cohesion required to exist within these platforms. The pressure to maintain a defined digital self bleeds into the ontological self. You stop asking, what do I truly feel or want? And start asking, does this feeling or desire align with the person I have established myself to be? You are constantly checking your internal sensors against the official manifesto. The philosophical impact is profound. True liberation might not be found in knowing who you are, but in perpetually forgetting who you are supposed to be. The most crucial philosophical breakthroughs always occur when the self-narrative collapses, when you realize the boundaries you thought were protecting you were actually just the walls of your own perfectly defined cell. To be truly free, you must maintain a strategic skepticism toward your own categories, your own labels, and your own history. You must understand that the self is not a noun, it is an action. The greatest freedom, then, is not the freedom to be yourself, but the freedom to perpetually refuse definition. Stop searching for your fixed core. There is only the continuous, terrifying, magnificent space of becoming. Strategic detachment, liberating ourselves from imposed identities. Strategic detachment, the practice of self-sovereignty. Before you drift further, consider the weight of the labels you carry. Examine the identities meticulously constructed by culture and expectation, the roles you inhabit, the narratives you perform. Are they suits of armor protecting your core, or are they chains forged in habit and mistaken for bone? This is the central inquiry of strategic detachment, realizing that the self you present to the world, the successful careerist, the devoted partner, the righteous activist, is not the sovereign self. It is an imposed identity, an accumulation of expectations, disciplinary norms, and the rigid classifications assigned to you by institutions, family, market, state. Foucault understood this deeply. He described the process of subjectivation, where power molds us into subjects, defined, observable, and controllable entities. We are not born subjects, we are made subjects, defined by the power structures that require our obedience and our measurable participation. Strategic detachment is the crucial philosophical maneuver of recognizing that the actor and the role are not the same entity. Imagine for a moment the identity you wear is a deep-sea diving suit. It is complex, restrictive, and absolutely essential for navigating the crushing pressure of the deep environment, the world of work, social metrics, and transactional relationships. This suit allows you to function, to survive, to extract resources. But if you forget that you can take it off when you reach dry land, if you try to live your whole life confined by the heavy, pressurized rubber and steel, you become paralyzed by its necessity. You mistake the necessary apparatus of engagement for the actual body within. The world requires the uniform, but your internal sovereignty demands that you remember it is temporary, provisional, and ultimately external. The mechanism of control is subtle because it is self-enforced. The moment we derive our validation through the success or failure of the imposed identity, we strengthen the cage. We dedicate endless psychological energy to polishing the suit, defending the label, and ensuring that the designated role remains flawless in the eyes of the observing power. This is the inherent paradox. We seek freedom, but we define that freedom by achieving success within the very systems that restrict us. When the identity inevitably fails, a career path dissolves, a relationship is severed, a belief system collapses, the entire sense of self often feels destroyed. This reveals how thoroughly we outsourced our stability, our worth, and our spiritual center to external roles and the opinions they generated. The terror of being nothing is really the terror of dropping the heavy suit and realizing that underneath, the undefined sovereign self feels terrifyingly boundless. Apply this lens to the grinding anxiety of the modern age. We live under the constant pressure to optimize, categorize, and brand ourselves. Every social media profile, every curated resume, every professional title demands that we adhere to a tight, marketable narrative. We are engaged in constant, internalized self-policing to maintain the approved version of our imposed identity. Strategic detachment is the radical practice of stepping back from this apparatus. It is the ability to observe the pressure to conform without automatically obeying it. It means acknowledging the demands of the world, the need for income, the need for social harmony, but refusing to let those demands define the interior landscape of who you are. The impact of this practice is profound. You cease to be merely a product of your environment, shaped entirely by external forces, and become, instead, the astute observer of that product. This is the origin point of true inner peace, the ability to let external judgment, whether praise or criticism, bounce off the temporary role, leaving the essential core self entirely untouched. You shift your center of gravity from the highly visible, highly volatile circumference of your life to the quiet, unassailable core. The world can praise the uniform or condemn it, but neither opinion can touch the reality of the person who simply chooses when and how to wear it. The lightest burdens we carry are the ones we never pick up. Liberate yourself from the expectation of being what you already are not. Shed the imposed identity. Recognize the strategic utility of the mask, but remember the freedom of the face beneath. Building your own enclosure, the art of limiting yourself to be free. The voluntary prison, the practice of self-limitation. We spend our lives chasing the horizon of absolute freedom, believing instinctively that more choice equals more liberty. We crave the abolition of rules, the dissolution of walls, the endless, sprawling landscape of possibility. But if you look closely at the moments of your greatest clarity, your deepest creation, or your most potent sense of self, those moments were never boundless. They were highly concentrated, fiercely focused, and defined by acute boundaries. When was the last time endless possibility felt like wings instead of an unbearable weight? What if the highest form of freedom is not the abolition of all walls, but the meticulous, difficult construction of specific, self-chosen ones? Foucault spent years charting how institutional power built cages around us, the factory, the prison, the asylum. But toward the end of his inquiry, his lens turned inward, asking, how do we voluntarily build useful enclosures around ourselves? This moves past institutional critique and enters the realm of the aesthetics of existence, the disciplined creation of parameters, frameworks chosen not for comfort or institutional compliance, but for internal cultivation and mastery. It is the understanding that the infinite universe of what-ifs inevitably paralyzes the specific act of what is. You cannot master everything. Therefore, to achieve meaningful freedom, you must willingly discard almost everything else. Consider the writer, the painter, or the musician. The writer is not free to use any word in any order. The musician is not free to hit any note at any time. The constraint of grammar, the self-imposed limits of form, the sonnet, the haiku, the 12-bar blues, these are the prison cells that paradoxically enable the articulation of something enduring. If the writer had total linguistic freedom, they would produce noise. By accepting the precise, narrow fence of the form, they gain the ability to articulate meaning. The boundary isn't a restriction on expression. It is the fundamental condition for expression. This is where the discomfort lies, because we have been trained by modernity to equate discipline with being less alive. We see limitation as a failure of potential, but look closer at the mechanism. True, rigorous discipline is the practice of selectively starving your options so that the few remaining can thrive. It is the choice to say no to 1,000 good things so that you can say yes to the one great thing you have chosen to define your existence. The tension arises because the market, the media, the modern technological apparatus demands infinite availability from you. Your presence must be broadcast everywhere, your attention perpetually fragmenting. But if you are available to everything, you are truly present to nothing. The enclosure you build is not meant to keep the world out of boredom. It is meant to protect your focus from the ceaseless, corrosive dissipation of energy, creating a sacred space where power can be accumulated and then strategically deployed. In the age of algorithmic overwhelm, where the input stream is endless and designed to maximize your consumption, building your enclosure is an act of fierce, necessary resistance. It's choosing a fixed daily schedule, not because you have a tyrannical boss, but because you realize that decision fatigue is the great enemy of authentic action. It's limiting your digital consumption, not because you lack the willpower to browse, but because you understand that your attention is a finite, highly valuable resource, and leaving it unprotected is a form of philosophical negligence. You build the wall around your 4 hours of deep work. You define the rules for your engagement. You select the specific chains that bind your habits, and in doing so, you reclaim sovereignty over your time and your interior landscape. The resulting psychological shift is profound. We move from being managed by external forces like the boss, the market, the social timeline, to managing the self as a work of art. The boundaries you choose cease to feel like rules handed down by an impersonal system. They become the aesthetic constraints of your deliberately chosen existence. It's the difference between being forced to wear a uniform and choosing to wear ceremonial robes. Both are limitations, but one is a badge of servitude and the other is a declaration of sovereign intent. This is the ultimate self-fashioning, the careful, painful use of discipline as the essential tool of design. Do not seek the boundless plain. It is nothing but a desert, an overwhelming expanse where nothing can take root. Seek instead the fertile garden, enclosed by walls of your own careful choosing. True freedom is not the absence of boundaries, but the power to choose which boundaries define you. The only truly free person is the one who has decided what they will and will not accept. The clinical gaze, how we learn to see ourselves as patients. The clinical gaze, when diagnosis becomes identity. We talk so often about self-acceptance, about radical honesty with ourselves, but how often do you truly see yourself, unfiltered, before the system taught you precisely where to look for the cracks, the errors, the impending failure? We rarely encounter our bodies or minds as raw, spontaneous phenomena anymore. We meet them through a lens, a powerful instrument of assessment. This lens is what Foucault called the clinical gaze. It isn't just what the doctor does in the examination room, it is a structural shift. A reorganization of reality that began centuries ago when modern medicine decided to stop asking what ails you and started asking where is the lesion. It was the transformation of the subjective suffering of the ill person into the objective, dissectable object of the disease. The clinical gaze codified the body into legible systems, predictable symptoms, and quantifiable deficits. It made illness legible, manageable, and most importantly, addressable through specialized power. Foucault showed us that this shift toward objective, penetrating sight is never merely neutral knowledge. It is a profound exercise in power that defines the boundaries of normalcy. We, the inheritors of this structure, have internalized the gaze. Consider how you interact with your own data. You are not experiencing organic human sadness. You are tracking a mood deficit on an app designed to standardize affect. You are not merely tired. You have a sleep efficiency score of 68%, indicating a non-compliance issue with optimal functioning. You are not confused. You are struggling with executive dysfunction. This is the gaze operationalized. Every organic, chaotic experience must now be submitted to a quantitative grid, categorized and judged against an externally determined optimal baseline. Your body becomes a spreadsheet, and your primary job shifts from living to self-monitoring compliance. The central paradox here is excruciating. The more deeply you internalize this relentless self-monitoring, the more estranged you become from your actual subjective embodied self. You cease to trust the signals emerging from within. Instead, you begin to pre-diagnose your fatigue, categorize your low-grade anxiety before you truly feel it, and anticipate your own statistical failure based on predictive models. The gaze promised you definitive knowledge and control, but what it delivers is perpetual hypervigilance. You seek freedom from the specter of illness, yet you gain permanent residency within the diagnostic manual. We now live in a culture of perpetual potential patienthood. This is the substrate upon which the modern wellness industry is built. We perform self-care not as an intuitive act of restoration, but as preventative maintenance against statistical risk and as a required performance of optimization. Our deepest emotional struggles are immediately labeled and then categorized as manageable or profitable case studies for self-improvement seminars, retreats, and coaches. We are perpetually searching for an objective pathology, a clean, scientifically validated deficit, to explain our existential discomfort, our unavoidable human vulnerability. The heaviest consequence of this internalization is the profound erosion of self-trust. If every internal sensation, a twinge, a moment of lethargy, a deviation in heart rate, must be checked, measured, and assessed against a standardized definition of wellness, then your internal, intuitive voice loses all authority. You stop being the subject of your life, and you become the monitored project, the data point in the system. Your identity shifts. It is no longer defined by who I am, but by the continuous, quantifiable result of standardized assessments. You become remarkably skilled at performing your own diagnosis, at spotting the incipient defect before anyone else can. You trade the ambiguity and richness of being alive for the certainty and sterility of being analyzed. Stop for a moment and ask yourself, are you genuinely feeling your life, or are you just efficiently running the diagnostic software on yourself? The clinical gaze taught you how to see yourself clearly, but only as a specimen under glass. And sometimes the clearest sight is the most profound alienation. The violence of classification, naming the world into submission, the epistemic cage. You probably find a profound sense of peace when you manage to organize your life, labeling files, creating taxonomies of your daily habits, defining your relationships. We crave the clean lines of categorization. But what if that deep foundational urge to classify the world, to name it, to define it, is fundamentally hostile? What if every definition you rely on is a silent weapon used against the chaos, aimed at the undefined, and ultimately pointed back at you? Foucault suggested that knowledge is never innocent. It is always a deployment of power. Specifically, our societal drive to classify the world, to categorize mental illness, to define sexual deviance, to chart criminal behavior, is not merely an act of passive understanding, but the very first necessary step in subjugation. Before we can imprison a group, or exclude them, or treat them, we must first invent the category that contains them. This is the violence of classification, the process of naming the world into submission. The structure of knowledge, the way we arrange and partition reality, dictates the limits of acceptable life. It sets the rules for visibility and invisibility. Think of the birth of the great modern institutions in the 18th century, the asylum, the prison, the public clinic. Their operational tool wasn't a whip or a physical barrier. It was the ledger, the catalog, the diagnostic manual. They weren't just reacting to existing social problems. They were inventing new forms of human difference that could be controlled. Imagine taxonomy, not applied to daisies and beetles, but applied with chilling precision to the varieties of the mad or the degenerate. Doctors and social reformers labored not to understand the subjective experience of the person, but to classify the repeatable, controllable symptom. Naming the symptom transforms the volatile, complex human experience into a manageable, reproducible problem suitable for institutional isolation. The act of assigning a label, such as hysteria or perversion, is the original act of incarceration. Once you have a name for the thing, you can treat it as a thing, rather than as a person. The great irony is that classification always promises clarity and liberation from chaos. It seems like the most rational endeavor. But every label, while defining one thing, necessarily excludes and invalidates everything that falls just outside its clean boundary. It creates a space of non-being, a realm of impossibility for those who resist the categories. When we classify someone as mentally ill based on the DSM or as criminal based on statute, we are not describing a static truth. We are activating a vast, interlocking machine that assigns roles, dictates treatment, and justifies exclusion. The label, in its scientific and clinical authority, does the work of submission, even if it is spoken with the softest, most neutral clinical voice. Look at the modern landscape, and you see the epistemic cage multiplied 1,000-fold. We are drowning in labels. Algorithms classify our preferences. Our personalities are reduced to 5-factor models for HR departments. And political enemies are reduced to 2-word, easily digestible hashtags. The digital self is an infinitely classified self, parceled out across platforms. Each tag is a tiny, high-resolution hook, pulling you into a predetermined pool of expectations and behaviors. The violence in the digital age isn't often physical. It's the systematic reduction of your infinite potentiality into a finite, predictable, and manageable data point. The system doesn't need to chain you if it can perfectly define you. This is why classification is fundamentally violent to the soul. It forces the messy, evolving, contradictory reality of the human being into a static, easy-to-manage container. It robs you of your complexity and limits the ways you are allowed to exist in the world, subtly transforming who you are into what you are. The deepest anxiety here is the paralyzing fear that the label assigned by the system, by the doctor, the algorithm, the census, has become more real, more authoritative than the actual, living life it claims to describe. Sleep on this uncomfortable truth. If you believe you know the world in its entirety, if you feel confident in your neat distinctions, you have already begun the silent work of submitting it. The moment we name a thing, we prepare the cage for its existence. Living at the limit, the necessity and danger of transgression. Tonight, we must confront the edge. Have you ever felt the deepest truth about yourself lies just beyond what you are currently allowed to be? That the structure of your identity, your morality, your career, your relationships, is a cage whose bars are less about protection and more about definition? Tonight, we consider the absolute limit, the necessity and the danger of transgression. We are not talking about simple rule-breaking, minor acts of delinquency, or bending the social contract. Foucault's concept of transgression is the movement across the fundamental line, the radical encounter with the limit itself. It is the act that confirms the existence of the boundary, even as it attempts, impossibly, to erase it for a moment. This concept is dangerous because it challenges the very categories, good and evil, rational and mad, permitted and forbidden, that structure your sanity and your world. These limits are not arbitrary obstacles. They are the scaffold upon which you are built. Without them, you cannot define yourself, but to find any true, self-authored meaning, you must look past them. Imagine the high, seamless wall of a maximum security enclosure. All the rules, all the social dynamics, all the power structures exist entirely on this side of the concrete. Transgression is not throwing a punch at a guard. That merely reinforces the guard's authority and the system's power. True transgression is acquiring a drill and boring a hole, not necessarily to escape, but just deep enough to peer into the void beyond the system's jurisdiction. It is the moment you confront the pure, silent indifference of the outside. The act of drilling defines the wall by destroying a fraction of it. You see that the system is arbitrary, yet you must return, changed, to the arbitrary system you inhabit. Here lies the profound tension. Transgression is not a permanent abolition of the limit. It is an affirmation of the limit achieved by momentarily stepping outside of its shadow. It is an impossible act. If the limit is truly fundamental, say, the boundary between rational speech and madness or life and death, you cannot truly transgress it and return intact. Yet, if you never strain against it, you remain fundamentally unknowing, defined only by the negative space of the rules imposed upon you. The mechanism demands that you push yourself to the breaking point, but never shatter completely. The paradox is this: the subject who attempts transgression must be willing to become a non-subject, an outlaw, or a madman, just long enough to glimpse the truth hidden by the safety of the known. Think about how this plays out in modern life, in the quiet, inner revolutions. Consider the professional who decides to shed the rigid identity conferred by their career and pursue a radical, financially illogical path simply because the prior structure became suffocating. Or the person who challenges a long-held sexual or moral identity imposed by their family or culture. These are not minor rebellions. They are deep personal transgressions that destabilize your core sense of self. They are necessary to define who you are beyond the categories given to you by the world, but they involve a fundamental risk of losing social belonging, approval, and internal stability. You risk sanity for definition. The psychological impact of facing the limit is the realization that your morality is constructed atop an abyss. Transgression forces you to acknowledge that the foundations of knowledge, virtue, and identity are contingent, not eternal. You are no longer navigating a fixed map of rules handed down from above, but standing perpetually at a boundary line you drew yourself, or one that was drawn for you. This realization is profoundly unsettling. It means that true self-mastery is not adherence to a static code, but the continuous, terrifying negotiation of where that code should stop. The limit is only real if you refuse to touch it, but remember, the cost of seeing clearly is often the inability to live comfortably in the shadow. The greatest danger is not the limit itself, but the possibility that you never truly discover where it lies. Sleep now, and consider which boundaries you have yet to press. The silence of the archives. What official history chooses to forget you lie here, ready to let go of the day, trusting the historical framework that supports your reality, the dates, the names, the declared facts. But what if the greatest power held by history isn't what it includes, but what it meticulously omits? What if the official record, the history you trust, is not an inventory of truth, but rather a blueprint of regulated forgetting? This is the concept Foucault identified within the deepest corners of institutional control: the strategic construction of the archive and the productive power of silence. Foucault didn't see the archive, that vast, cold room of records, as a benign filing cabinet. He saw it as the ultimate weapon of regulatory power, a mechanism where knowledge is not merely stored, but actively produced and controlled. The archive is the system that dictates the rules of speaking, the threshold of credibility, and the definition of what constitutes a legitimate voice. It is the space where the boundaries of permissible discourse are rigorously enforced, often long before any utterance is even made. Think of the silence. We assume history is noise, a sequence of declarations, laws, and battles. But listen closer. The foundational power of any governing structure rests in its ability to generate structural silence, the active administrative exclusion of voices, events, and perspectives that would destabilize the dominant narrative. This is not about accident, error, or simple neglect. This is political architecture. It is the formalized choice to forget, codified and filed away under irrelevant or non-existent. Imagine walking into a vast, cold library that represents official history. You see shelves upon shelves, millions of organized truths. But look not at the spines, but at the gaps. Look to the empty spaces where the light doesn't quite reach. For every memoir written by the powerful, there is a ghost library containing the journals of the defeated, the official reports that were systematically shredded, the specific forms of madness, sexuality, or resistance that were rendered invisible because they violated the reigning discourse of sanity or morality at the time. Those ghosts, those intentional voids, are the true indicators of power's boundaries. The archive works by limiting what we can even imagine saying. If a concept is not cataloged, if a historical experience is not given a name within the official terminology, it ceases, effectively, to exist as a viable subject for political critique or recognition. The mechanism of power here is subtle, yet devastating. It doesn't shout down dissent. It simply ensures that the language required for that dissent is never taught. You are silenced not by direct censorship, but by the institutional absence of vocabulary, the lack of historical precedent, or the manufactured consensus that states definitively that issue never happened. The archive does not lie. It merely defines the rules for what counts as the truth that can be told. We live this mechanism every day. We are the keepers of our own archives. To present a stable self to the world, how many past embarrassments, contradictory desires, and inconvenient truths about your younger self must you systematically suppress? You perform a constant internal triage, classifying memories as relevant truth or dangerous noise. You silence your own past to maintain the current approved narrative of who you are. You curate your personal history to sustain your current identity. The real discomfort, the crucial insight, lies in understanding that your immediate comfort and stability are contingent on accepting these manufactured voids. To challenge the archive is to accept profound instability, to realize that the foundations of what you were told was solid ground are riddled with holes, deliberate excavations designed to bury alternative possibilities and alternative worlds. The philosophical task, then, is not merely to read the existing books, but to hear the echoes of the documents that were burned or never allowed to be printed. Listen for the negative space in the historical canvas, because it is in the silence, the calculated absences, that the architecture of power is most ruthlessly and most clearly revealed. When you close your eyes tonight, don't just review the day's facts. Ask yourself, what did the official narrative of my life or my world require me to forget, just so I could finally sleep? Managed liberties, the illusion of choice in a controlled field. The engineered freedom, why your choices are optimized for the system. When you settle into the quiet of the late night and the day's demands finally recede, ask yourself a deeply uncomfortable question. When you choose your path, are you truly navigating, or are you just selecting a pre-approved lane laid out by the architects of your comfort? Are you exercising autonomy, or simply participating in an optimization strategy designed around your compliance? This brings us to a crucial dimension of hidden power. Not the power that violently says no, but the far more sophisticated modern power that meticulously frames the options that guarantee a beneficial yes. This is the core concept of managed liberties. Foucault rarely spoke of freedom. He spoke of the techniques that subtly shape the subject. Managed liberty is the modern manifestation. The systems controlling our society, be they economic, political, or algorithmic, grant you a seemingly wide field of activity, provided that activity ultimately contributes to the stability, efficiency, and perpetuation of the field itself. Your freedom is not an escape route, it is a productive asset. Imagine the grand, brightly lit consumer sphere. You have thousands of products to choose from: organic, GMO, sustainable, fast fashion, a dizzying array of personalized choice. You feel utterly free, powerful even, because your specific preference can be instantly catered to. But the system that controls the supply chains, the pricing models, the data harvesting, and the advertising algorithms predicting your purchase history, that system doesn't care which specific brand you choose. It only cares that you choose, that your choice reinforces the necessity of the market, and that your transaction is recorded. Your consumption is guaranteed. Only the flavor profile is yours to decide. The brilliance of managed liberty lies in its ability to bypass overt coercion. If I restrict your choices completely, you will invariably rebel, or at least dedicate your energy towards subversion. But if I give you 2, 3, or even a dozen acceptable, highly marketed choices, A, B, C, you focus all your revolutionary energy on the minor, superficial differences between them, convincing yourself that the choice itself is the battleground. The mechanism fundamentally shifts the burden of control onto your own shoulders. You become the vigilant guard of your own options, constantly justifying your compliance by citing your own autonomous selection process. This system relies entirely on internalized discipline. You chose this job, you chose this mortgage, you chose this neighborhood, you chose this social platform. Therefore, the system must be fundamentally just, because you endorsed it with your perceived freedom. The pressure to choose correctly, to optimize your life, to maximize your potential, is the most pervasive form of surveillance imaginable because it is self-enforced, 24 hours a day, sustained by the fear of being the only one who failed to make the right selection. Look closely at the architecture of contemporary existence. Career paths are optimized mazes with defined entry and exit points. Digital spaces are recommendation tunnels that shepherd you toward profitable engagement. When you scroll through infinite content options, that is managed liberty in action. You are exercising choice, yes, but only within the pre-screened pool of content creators and platforms who have paid to exist within that transactional space. The structure ensures predictable outcomes, data collected, narratives controlled, revenue secured, while you exhaust your limited mental energy arguing over the optimal shade of filter or the precise political identity you wish to inhabit. This relentless demand for self-optimization within predefined parameters creates a profound, quiet psychological drain. The failure to achieve fulfillment is rarely, if ever, blamed on the limitations of the managed field itself. Instead, it is attributed internally. If the system is so efficiently designed for your success, and you chose to participate, then your stagnation is simply evidence of your personal inadequacy, your lack of grit, or your poor time management. We are trapped not by overtly restrictive walls, but by highly seductive pathways leading consistently to the same controlled productive center. The deepest discomfort arises when you realize that your most radical acts within this field, your attempts to descend, to carve out uniqueness, are often anticipated and pre-calculated variations, simply feeding new data back into the system that already holds the monopoly on the game board. True freedom is not having 1,000 options within the cage. It is recognizing the cage as a cage, even when the bars are polished chrome and the door is always politely open to the next optimized path. The ritual of confession, exchanging privacy for validation. We need to talk about confession, not the kind you do in a darkened booth with a priest, but the one you perform daily on illuminated screens, the one fueled not by guilt, but by the agonizing need for acknowledgement. This is the concept Foucault identified as a central engine of modern subjectivity, the ritual of confession. Think about the last thing you willingly revealed about yourself that you knew carried a social cost, a genuine vulnerability, a hidden anxiety, or a deeply private desire. Why did you say it? Did you feel lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted? Or were you instantly cataloged, your complex internal landscape reduced to a manageable label? Foucault traced the technology of confession back to the 17th century, arguing it became the dominant mechanism for producing truth about the self. Historically, confession was primarily tied to spiritual penance, but over time, it exploded, becoming the foundation for medicine, psychology, education, and ultimately our entire contemporary understanding of identity. Before this era, desire or personal eccentricity was simply something you did. Afterward, it became something you confessed, a profound secret that defined your identity and required external scrutiny and analysis. This shift wasn't about freeing the self through expression, it was about forcing the self to articulate its desires into a language the authority, whether religious, scientific, or digital, could manage and control. We adopted the dangerous belief that our salvation, whether spiritual, psychological, or social, is found only in full, relentless disclosure. Imagine the architecture of the modern confessional booth. It's not wood and velvet, it's white light and an infinite comment section. You don't confess sins, you confess your identity, your trauma, your niche obsessions, your mental health struggles, the contours of your most intimate relationships. You offer up this deeply personal data, these hard-won vulnerabilities, into the public or semi-public sphere. You do this because the currency of modern belonging is not silence, but radical transparency. Your perceived authenticity is measured by the quality and quantity of the personal darkness you expose. Here is the devastating paradox at the heart of the ritual. We confess because we believe it will liberate us from the burden of secrecy, but in the very act of speaking, we define ourselves within the boundaries of the systems that seek to manage us. We actively trade privacy for temporary validation. The moment you name your anxiety as a disorder, you gain temporary comfort and community, but you also give the therapist, the platform, the algorithm, or the peer group a precise, definable label by which to categorize and, crucially, normalize you. You are given a ready-made script for your suffering, which makes you understandable and therefore governable. Power, in this system, doesn't need to prohibit speech. It simply needs to incite it, compelling you to speak the truth of your existence, not to set you free, but to incorporate you into its ever-expanding database of human knowledge. Look at the constant pressure to participate in trauma sharing online, or the cultural expectation that every intimate struggle must be documented and processed publicly. We mistake vulnerability, this public display of interiority, for genuine intimacy. We are constantly producing a carefully managed narrative of the self, a neatly packaged, emotionally complex, yet ultimately consumable story that can be validated by likes, hearts, or therapeutic affirmations. If you don't share your story, you are considered reserved, opaque, perhaps even suspicious. The societal demand is not merely to have a truth, but to perform it constantly, making your subjective self eternally available for external assessment and modification. The constant practice of confession trains you to view yourself primarily through the eyes of the external authority, the perceived gaze of the world. You become your own relentless inquisitor, constantly monitoring your thoughts and feelings, preemptively filtering and preparing the acceptable narrative before you ever speak it. This is how the apparatus of power is internalized. You don't need a warden when you are busy confessing every transgression and hidden desire to an invisible audience. This shift fundamentally alters the nature of autonomy. Ask yourself honestly, are you speaking your truth, or are you speaking the truth you know will most efficiently earn you acceptance and validation within the predefined narrative structures? We are taught to believe that silence is weakness and that speech is inherent power. But Foucault asks us to consider the radical alternative. What if the greatest, most profound act of rebellion available in this transparent age is simply to refuse the demand for self-disclosure, to choose to keep the most essential, messy, and profound parts of yourself unsaid, undocumented, and therefore truly ungovernable? The carceral society, when all institutions become prisons. The carceral society, the invisible bars of modern life. You know that feeling of being judged even when you are entirely alone, sitting quietly in your room? It's a subtle, almost internal pressure, a whisper telling you to adjust your posture, to stop wasting time, to be better. But what if that inner voice of judgment wasn't entirely yours? What if it was a ghost of continuous systemic monitoring, woven into the very architecture of your existence? Sleep on this idea. Are you truly free, or are you just functioning optimally within a vast architectural constraint, a meticulously crafted cage you mistake for the world? We need to talk about Foucault's final nightmare. The carceral society is not just a study of prisons. It's the chilling realization that the mechanisms of discipline and control, first perfected behind literal bars in the 18th and 19th centuries, have successfully escaped their confinement. Originating largely from his detailed work charting the shift from public, spectacular punishment to silent, bureaucratic, disciplinary correction, the concept argues that schools, military bases, hospitals, factories, and modern offices all utilize the same core grid of normalization, examination, and temporal control. They are all cousins to the prison, sharing the identical DNA of required conformity and constant, if ambient, surveillance. They exist not primarily to educate or heal, but to produce the docile, predictable citizen, the perfect subject. Imagine a university campus or a highly structured corporate headquarters. Do not see it as a place of freedom, but as a total institution designed to grade, classify, normalize, and track progress until you are deemed fit for the next societal box. The deadlines, the standardized tests, the required weekly reports, the performance reviews, these aren't merely administrative necessities, they are techniques of docile body production. The hospital ensures you are normalized physically, the school intellectually, the factory economically. You move seamlessly from one specialized, enclosed, examining system to the next, constantly benchmarked against a mathematical standard of normalcy. The deepest paradox of the carceral society is that it doesn't need physical chains anymore. It relies entirely on the successful internalization of the guard. This is the essence of the Panopticon principle, the persistent feeling that you might be watched, which makes constant watching superfluous. We become highly efficient self-police. We schedule our self-improvement, monitor our metrics, and punish our own minor deviations before the actual institution ever needs to intervene. The tension here is exquisite. We demand political freedom and personal autonomy, yet we actively participate in structuring our own confinement through obsessing over productivity metrics, managing our public social media performance, and striving toward an optimal well-being. all standards defined by the very systems we are attempting to critique. Now look at your phone. It is a universal tool, yes, but it has simultaneously become the most powerful carceral mechanism ever invented. It demands your documentation, tracks your location, monitors your attention, and demands your standardized responses across countless apps. Every notification, every swipe, every recommendation reinforces the norm of the productive, predictable citizen. Your health app tells you if you are deviating from the healthy or active norm. Your work software tracks your efficiency across geographic boundaries. The boundary between the official institutional space and your private, intimate space has utterly dissolved. You are no longer merely a subject of the system. You are now the administrator of your own compliance, carrying the prison blueprint in your pocket. The devastating psychological impact is the slow erosion of genuine self-determination and the crushing burden of permanent accountability. If the framework of our reality is already designed to classify, normalize, and correct deviation, then authentic rebellion, radical difference, or even basic eccentricity becomes extremely difficult to articulate, let alone execute, without incurring the system's quiet, algorithmic punishment. We live in constant, low-grade anxiety, driven by the pressure to perpetually prove we are not the exception, that we are worth the system's validation and investment. This normalized, persistent fear is the carceral society's most elegant and effective chain. We spent centuries trying to tear down the literal walls of the Bastille, only to find that we had meticulously and eagerly rebuilt them, brick by silent brick, inside ourselves, making every single choice we make a perfectly measured walk down a perfectly monitored, invisible corridor. The internal warden, the cost of watching yourself watch. We must talk about the perpetual gaze, the mechanism of self-punishment that you carry. It is the cost of absolute self-imposed normalization, and it is quietly exhausting you. Tell me honestly, how much energy do you spend rehearsing conversations, editing your thoughts before they fully form, or grading your productivity before the day is even done? That exhaustion is not simply from external pressure. It is the fundamental weariness of the internalized observer. It is the fatigue of being perpetually seen by a judgment that resides entirely within your own skull. Foucault describes the Panopticon, a brilliant, terrible architectural design where the inmate knows they might be watched at any moment. This knowledge forces them into a state of conscious, permanent visibility, rendering physical force obsolete. But the true genius of this disciplinary mechanism, the true danger, is when that architecture is outsourced. The prison walls disappear, the cell structure dissolves, but the watchtower doesn't. It migrates. It sets up shop in your cortex. You become both the inmate desperate for approval and the guard meticulously checking compliance, simultaneously. Imagine the center watchtower is actually empty. The warden clocked out and went home years ago, yet every single person in the ring continues to behave perfectly, quietly, adhering to the complex rules of visibility. They are disciplined, not because they see the threat, but because they feel the possibility of the gaze. This isn't discipline enforced by steel bars and chains. It's power enforced by imagination, anticipation, and the silent, terrifying fear of being found lacking. This internalized warden is not merely checking if you follow the explicit rules of society. It checks if you are normal. It measures your ambition against the prescribed societal trajectory, judges your pain against acceptable suffering, and filters your joy for marketable enthusiasm. The cost of this perpetual surveillance is astronomical. You don't just lose freedom of action, you lose the right to spontaneous, unedited selfhood. You dedicate vast psychic resources to preemptive self-correction, sacrificing authenticity on the altar of perpetual acceptability. This constant monitoring creates a profound and debilitating cognitive dissonance. The self for others must perpetually fight and suppress the self for self. The internal warden is the reason you freeze when you try to write something deeply personal or articulate an uncomfortable truth. It's the voice demanding, who will judge this? What utility does this hold? Does this adhere to the required profile? Before the thought is even fully formed. This mechanism is a subtle theft of life force, channeled not into living, but into the performance of compliance. The spontaneity required for genuine creativity and emotional intimacy is systematically dismantled by the fear of error. Look at the architecture of modern life. Every social platform, every curated feed is a little panopticon designed around instant metrics of worth. Every like count is a measurement of normalization. We don't just perform for an audience. We internalize the algorithm standards, projecting them onto our own identity. We curate our lives so expertly that the filter becomes the reality, even when the phone is face down and we are alone in the room. We are exhausted, not by the necessary demands of productive living, but by the relentless, mandatory performance required to satisfy the inner guard. The most insidious effect of this regime is the shattering of inner authority. When you perpetually defer to the assumed standards of the invisible watchman, you lose the crucial muscle memory for knowing what you truly want, independent of utility or external reception. Your desires become secondary data points, always subject to review. You forget what unobserved action feels like, or what unedited thought tastes like. Spontaneity becomes risky. It threatens the meticulously constructed self-image that the warden is tasked to protect. Ultimately, you trade genuine, messy self-knowledge for managed, lifeless conformity. The ultimate freedom is not breaking out of the societal cage, but locating and firing the guard within it. Find the empty watchtower inside your mind. Demand silence from the warden. That is the first essential step toward an unscripted life. Moral anesthesia, using virtue to justify domination. You think you're doing the right thing. You've built walls around your actions using the strongest material available, your own virtue. But what if that virtue isn't a shield against injustice, but the silent, slick lubricant for a more efficient form of control? This is the domain of moral anesthesia, using virtue to justify domination. We are taught to believe that power is inherently cynical, that those who seek to control are motivated by greed or malice. Foucault taught us a far more insidious truth. The most effective power structures don't rely on the visible chain and whip. They rely on you believing you should be controlled, or even better, believing that your control over others is a moral necessity, a burden you must carry for the greater good. Moral anesthesia is the cognitive state where the perceived goodness of the intent renders the violence of the outcome invisible. It is the psychological bypass switch flipped when we operate under the banner of care, safety, or improvement. When helping becomes identical to disciplining, you don't feel the friction of oppression, you feel the warmth of self-sacrifice. Consider the architecture of the perfect planned community, managed not by tyrants but by a council of righteousness. They institute mandatory neighborhood watches, comprehensive mental health check-ins, and curated educational pathways, all designed for your safety and for the community's optimal future. Every act of surveillance, every limitation placed on independent thought or free movement is meticulously wrapped in the shiny foil of care. The domination isn't cruel, it's merely responsible. When the citizen complies, they are being good. When they resist, they are being selfish, unstable, or threatening the collective well-being. The paradox lies in the insulation this belief provides. The more sincerely you believe you are acting for the good, the deeper the moral anesthesia sets in. If I impose rules because I believe them to be objectively correct and universally beneficial, perhaps based on data or science, I am immediately insulated from charges of tyranny. I am not a tyrant, I am a caretaker. The role demands sacrifice, not guilt. I feel heroic while enacting systems of profound standardization. For the person being controlled, the situation is emotionally paralyzing. How do you resist a force that claims to be working for your own betterment? The subjugated person isn't resisting an oppressor. They are, by definition, resisting their own wellness, their own improvement. This is the ultimate efficiency of power. It turns resistance into self-sabotage, proving the need for further intervention. It is a control loop disguised as empathy. Look at the architecture of your modern life. We willingly trade privacy for security, complexity for clarity, and autonomy for optimization. Every algorithm that curates your information feed, every corporate wellness program that monitors your steps and sleep, every social media campaign demanding absolute purity of thought, they are all administered by people absolutely convinced they are making the world better, safer, or cleaner. They aren't trying to oppress you, they are trying to manage you, to render your life predictable, productive, and harmless. The hand that guides the leash is gloved in ethical approval. Recognizing moral anesthesia requires a profound skepticism toward your own best intentions. You must learn to fear the moment you stop questioning your authority because you have declared your actions inherently virtuous. We are ethically lazy when we substitute the difficulty of genuine critique with the ease of moral self-assurance. The true philosophical challenge is not discerning good from evil, but discerning self-serving control from genuine empowerment, especially when both wear the exact same benevolent mask. It forces us to ask ourselves, is this act truly freeing, or is it merely standardizing compliance under the guise of care? The answer reveals whether you are truly acting ethically or just administering your own domination. The softest chains are always forged from the strongest beliefs. Be wary of the righteousness that grants permission for cruelty, for the most dangerous form of control is the one you welcome, believing it will save you. Resistance without revolution, the ethics of non-subjugation. The quiet refusal, ethics as an aesthetic of self. When the structures of control are woven into the very fabric of how you perceive the world, how do you resist without burning the world down? How do you simply stop participating in your own oppression? You lie here, waiting for sleep, recognizing that the battleground is not the state house or the prison wall, but the quiet interior chamber of your own conscience. This is the space we must claim tonight, the ethics of non-subjugation. We've spent time dissecting the external gaze, the Panopticon that shapes behavior through surveillance. Now, we turn to the interior landscape. The most profound critique Foucault offered in his later works was not a blueprint for political revolution, but a manual for personal sovereignty. Non-subjugation is the ethical practice of defining your own limits against the power that incessantly seeks to define those limits for you. It is the realization that the most dangerous authority is the one you willingly delegate to others over your internal life, over your habits, and over your sense of worth. This resistance is subtle, constant, and fundamentally ethical, rooted in self-governance rather than external conflict. To grasp this, consider an illustration. Imagine you are tasked with tending a vast, meticulously ordered garden. Every plant, every row, follows the official state botanical guidelines: efficiency, uniformity, total visibility. Revolutionary resistance would be torching the garden, ensuring its immediate destruction, leading inevitably to replacement and retribution. Non-subjugation, however, is simply choosing one small corner, a hidden patch behind the stone wall where the official gaze rarely falls, and cultivating it according to a logic only you understand. You still maintain the visible garden, yes, but you simultaneously create a small, sovereign territory of self-will where the official rules simply do not apply. It is the quiet act of cultivating a single, well-chosen weed, not to defy the garden, but to affirm your right to define what beauty and order truly mean. The core paradox of this resistance is that you must employ discipline to achieve freedom. Power seeks to categorize you, force you into a predetermined subject position, a passive recipient of prepackaged truths and rules. The ethical countermove is to actively shape yourself, to treat your life not as a given reality to be endured, but as a piece of living art waiting to be sculpted. This is the concept of the aesthetics of existence. You are not primarily fighting the system outside. You are meticulously crafting an identity inside that the system cannot easily categorize, contain, or control. The tension lies in the silent labor this requires. It takes immense internal discipline to consistently refuse external control. You must be severe with yourself, rigorous in your habits, demanding of your own integrity, to deny others the right to be arbitrarily severe with you. Think about the pressures of modern existence, the constant imperative to optimize, to monetize your identity, to package your suffering into consumable, emotionally digestible narratives. That is contemporary subjugation, rendered through surveillance and the demand for total, immediate transparency. Non-subjugation in this digital ecosystem means practicing radical opacity. It means allowing parts of your identity, your moments of genuine grief, your small bursts of unshareable joy, to remain unmarketable, untagged, and fundamentally unknown to the algorithms that profit from your visibility. It is the conscious, quiet choice to not document, to not perform, to simply be outside the camera frame. This refusal to translate your essence into currency is the deep ethical non-compliance we speak of. The psychological impact of this shift is profound. When you cease looking for external permission to be whole, or for external validation to define your actions, you realize that your primary ethical duty is self-maintenance against intrusion. This transforms anxiety into focus. You are no longer defined by what you lack in relation to the idealized standard constantly flashed across your screens, but by the integrity of your own self-imposed ethical structure. You become the caretaker and the enforcer of your own interior laws, responsible only to the aesthetic quality of your own soul. Revolution asks the loud, confrontational question, what will you fight for? Non-subjugation asks the quiet, infinitely more dangerous question as you fade into the darkness. What is sacred enough that you will refuse to let it be touched, analyzed, or commandeered? Sleep now on the knowledge that the greatest and most enduring act of resistance is often the silent construction of an interior life so disciplined and unique that the surrounding world has no handles left to grip. If you reached this far, you're one of the few who stayed conscious until the end. Write "I know the secret" in the comments, and share this reflection forward.